Today we welcome Dr. Jakob Vorstman, a child and adolescent psychiatrist and professor of psychiatry and Institute of Medical Science at the University of Toronto. His work focuses on psychiatric genetics, and he'll be telling us about his innovative research and assessment clinic, the Developmental Assessment of Genetically Susceptible Youth, known as DAGSY, at Sick Kids, designed to use genetic findings to improve the diagnosis, prognosis, and personalized treatment for children at risk of neurodevelopmental and psychiatric disorders. I'm here today with Dr. Jakob Vorstman, and I'm very glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So, one of the things I'd like to start off with is, there's a big academic introduction that I could do, etc. But
let's skip that.
Let's skip that. I think we should skip that. And I think actually our listeners would rather hear a few lines about what you would like to tell us about you, your career, just a few lines of introduction. Be much more interesting than what I could do.
Very well. So I grew up in the Netherlands, and from high school onwards, I wanted to do medicine. I had a very good friend. We knew each other from baby onwards, and unfortunately, he when he was 18, 19, he developed psychosis, and that kind of inspired me. I became even more interested in sort of mental health. Starting my studies, I thought about pediatrics. Then fast forward a few years, as part of my med school, I went to Calgary for a couple of months, 8 months or so, and I fell in love with Canada. And it's difficult not to fall in love with Canada. If you're in Calgary, it's beautiful. And I also got to work as part of my the time that I spent there with a child oncologist who was a clinician scientist. And there I just knew very, very, with a lot of certainty that I wanted to become a clinician scientist. Then I did my internships. I was on the pathway to become a pediatrician. And during my internships, I just met a series of children with mental health issues, predominantly mental health issues. And it just kind of reinvigorated my interest in mental health, and I asked my supervisor if I could do a few months of child psychiatry, and I promised him that I would come back to pediatrics, and I didn't keep my promise. Here I am.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Jakob, you and colleagues at Sick Kids have developed a very interesting clinic that focuses on a new way of incorporating genetics information into the identification and treatment planning for a certain group of kids. Can you tell us what the name, and I love the acronym, of the clinic is, and tell us who refers to your clinic and why?
All right. So the clinic is called DAGSY, and DAGSY stands for Developmental Assessment of Genetically Susceptible Youth. That's a mouthful, so we just say DAGSY.
DAGSY's better.
Yeah, DAGSY's better. And this is specifically for children and young people who are identified as carrying or a genetic variant. Now, I should say that we currently know, a little bit to our surprise, we didn't think so maybe 10 years ago, but we every single one of us, you and me, we carry genetic variants. And so,
Really?
that includes deletions and duplications, or little pieces missing and duplicated in the genome. We used to think that those were very rare, but they're actually very common.
Huh.
What I explain to my patients is that it really depends on where that deletion or duplication or single nucleotide variant is. It's like we know certain addresses on the genome, and if something happens there, we know that we have to pay attention, because the development of the brain, or sometimes other organs as well, is different, and that it translates to possible difficulties with learning, or intellectual disability, or behavioral, emotional problems. Now, to sort of cut back to your question, we are increasingly making those diagnoses, genetic diagnoses, very early in life. And when I say we, it's not psychiatry, it's the neonatologists and the pediatricians. And that's because genetic testing is powerful and it's gotten very cheap. So a baby that's born nowadays and has issues with immune or respiratory or bowel issues or congenital malformations, even mild ones, it's very high likelihood that a baby will be offered genetic testing. And so increasingly, newborns are being diagnosed with a genetic condition. And many of these genetic conditions also tell us that that particular child has a susceptibility to, for example, develop autism or intellectual disability. And so that's a new situation. It's really, and we need to do something. So the DAGSY clinic is an attempt to kind of address that new population of early diagnosed children.
So who are your referrers? Are they pediatricians or pediatric subspecialists?
They're mainly clinical geneticists because they're involved in making that diagnosis following genetic testing.
Right, I see. That makes sense. Okay. And what gap does this clinic fill? I understand that it's new that we have such early genetic testing, but why is there need for a clinic like this? What gap is it filling?
So the gap is that what's increasingly happening in our children's hospitals is that a newborn receives a diagnosis with a rare genetic variant, and let's say the rare genetic variant explains this child's cleft palate.
Okay.
Right? But that same genetic variant, we know from previous studies, also is associated with a likelihood of that child developing autism of, say, 30%. I'm just giving you an example, but it's a realistic example. Currently, that family is just going to be sent home with that information. So, and then they're home with their newborn and they're like, oh, okay, so my child has a 30% probability of developing autism. Now what? And how should we, so some parents are exceedingly worried, understandably.
Sure.
And they'll, when the child is 1.5 years old and throws her first tantrum, they're like, there you have it. It's autism, right? So these parents need guidance as to like what are the warning signs or the early signs of autism in this example. But also, what can you do to help stimulate communication and social interaction? All of this is in this example, of course. But yeah, so those are the things we try to do with this. That's the gap we're trying to address with this clinic.
So what kind of services or what kind of clinicians do you have in your clinic that try to fill that gap when someone, just like you described, a family comes in, and of course they would be very worried. It sounds very upsetting.
Yeah.
How do you go about trying to ameliorate this problem?
So I'm very lucky to have an interdisciplinary team. So I'm a child psychiatrist, but I work very closely with Dr. Summers, who is a psychologist, with extraordinary expertise in assessing and evaluating young children, and a psychometrist who helps with the testing, of course. And we also have genetic counselors. So what we do concretely when a new family is referred to us, our genetic counselor is going to go through the literature and find out what is known about this particular genetic variant of this child in terms of its associated risk or profile of vulnerabilities regarding ADHD, learning, intellectual disability. So these genetic variants, they all have their own profile of risk. They're not all the same. And so our report always starts with a summary it's a little review of the literature, what's known so far. And what I've discovered is that for parents of a child who oftentimes the variant is exceedingly rare, to come into our clinic and then have us say, your child is here because of variant XYZ, and this is what we know about it, and so on. Only saying this sometimes gets them into tears. They're like, they say, oh, this is the first time we meet a doctor that actually knows something about this rare condition. What they're used to hearing is, oh, what is that gene? I've never heard about it. Like, and that's very disconcerting for parents if
Yes.
they go look for
Yeah.
medical care.
So certainly one of the gaps you're filling is just psychological peace of mind, although of course you can't definitively tell them, what's going to happen
No,
in the future. No,
no,
none of us can.
no.
But just a knowing that there's a name or a mechanism or
Yeah.
things like that can be at least calming for a family.
Yes.
But it sounds like also you go through and you have a name, or maybe do you sometimes find that a child is a member of a very small group worldwide with a particular genetic variant? And how does that affect parents if they know, or how does it affect the work that you do if you
Yeah.
found one of 5 or something like that?
Yeah, I have to say that actually happens frequently. And then we go, like I just said, like our genetic counselor goes through literature only to discover that there's one paper and there are 5 cases across the world that have been described. And it's very challenging for the parents. So in those cases, we just, parents know this, right? So we don't say anything new. But what we do is say, listen, we can't look into the future, right? We
Right.
never can. But we can be very thoughtful and very comprehensive in assessing the profile of your child. And what are the strengths and weaknesses in terms of cognition, social understanding, academics, and also behaviorally, sort of psychiatric assessments. And even though that doesn't solve anything, it's almost ammunition for the parents to advocate for necessary support. If we, for example, find out that the child has difficulties with processing, right? So that's information that becomes relevant. Then they can communicate that to school, and help. The teacher can accommodate the way approaches the child, for example. And this is just one example.
So your team is able to put together an analysis or a formulation
Yes.
of what could be the problems to expect, and then to give them potential interventions, solutions to try to at
Yes.
least mitigate what might happen.
Yes, if you allow me, I'll like to be a little bit more precise about it. It's not necessarily that we can tell them what to expect, but we can tell them this is what your child is able to do. These are the strengths and these are the sort of weaknesses or fragilities. So you can act on those. You can say, well, if the child, I'm giving you an example. One that is quite recurrent, it's a rare variant, but we see them quite often, is the 22q deletion. These children often have learning disabilities, but specifically they have problems with math.
Okay.
And that's been shown in studies that done not by me, but by other groups. And so sometimes it's just extremely helpful to tell parents, your child's ability to do math is just very low. You should maybe focus on something else. And I sometimes make the analogy and say it's like being colorblind, right? So once you discover somebody is colorblind, you ought to stop trying to convince that person, you should learn difference between, what is it? Blue and green.
Brown and green, right.
Yeah, because he or she just doesn't see it and won't see it, even if you repeat it 1,000 times. And it leads to a lot of frustration. You could now focus your attention on sort of what are practical solutions. I always give this example. If you're in traffic, if you don't see the traffic light colors, you can still kind of know, like the upper light is red and the lower light is green, or the other way around. I forgot. But anyway, it's important to know the difference. But, you see what I mean? So there's ways to get around it. And that's the same for math. Stop. I would say tell parents, just stop focusing on getting the child to learn math if really he's not able to do it, and just focus on the things he's able to learn.
So what you're really talking about is helping them, which as parents, all of us are trying to do for our children. We're helping them adapt.
Yes.
This fits well, it seems to me, even if in the precision mental health paradigm, you can't in your clinic say, oh, I've now found the answer to your child's presentation and we can then fix it. Even if you can't do that, you can say, we found the likelihood of the cause of the presentation, and let's talk about adapting. So it's
Yes.
almost like precision adaptation.
Yes, that makes sense to me.
So that's very interesting and sounds very helpful. How can your clinic also feed the engine of research in this area?
Oh, yeah. Oh, in many ways, because what we're doing right now is the best we can do. And I'm happy we're doing it, but it's also very limited. So I'm going to give you again, going back to the example of the 22q11.2 deletion. So that's a recurrent variant. We call it sort of the common amongst the rare variants. It's like one of the more common amongst it's still rare, but it occurs in something like 1 in 1 to 2,000 individuals.
Okay.
Right. If you have that variant, your likelihood of developing schizophrenia, which, as you know, is one of the more severe mental health conditions, is 25%. So any child, any baby born with the 22q deletion, you just know there's a 25% risk of this child developing schizophrenia. This is something we've known now for more than 2 decades.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a bit sobering to realize that even though we've known this for 2 decades, there's still not a good program that acts on this, that say, well, we know that your child has a 25% risk of schizophrenia. We're going to offer this and this, or we're going to intervene in this and this. Apart from saying, let's monitor this child throughout adolescence, that's something we do, and it's not nothing. But it's very limited. If you compare it to, for example, we're now able to identify a number of genetic variants that are associated with heart arrhythmias.
Okay.
And they can occur all of a sudden, and they're very dangerous. It can be fatal. And you can imagine that any child that currently, nowadays, is being identified with a variant that predicts that this child is at risk for a heart arrhythmia, they're sent right away to the cardiologist. We don't somehow not do this with mental health. So we know that 25% of children with 22q have a risk of, will develop schizophrenia. Yet, as a field, as a group of child psychiatrists, we tell parents, call us if he starts hearing voices. Right? So that breaks your heart, isn't it?
It's not that helpful.
No, it's not that helpful. And we have to acknowledge that we don't have the same type of interventions available. But to your question, like, what are the research opportunities? Well, for example, we should look at, and we are looking at, how can we further increase the precision of prediction in individual carriers. So if a child is born with the 22q deletion, like I just told, and just giving you this example because it's a very clear example, but there are so many other genetic variants.
Right, you study many other ones.
Yeah, but if you know that the child has this deletion, you can say, well, there's 25% liability or likelihood of developing schizophrenia. Well, what about you use the rest of that child's genome to further sort of improve that prediction, between quotation mark, but be more precise about that prediction? What if you look at, that's something we've looked at, what if you take into account the rest of the genome, and now you can actually identify or distinguish one child with the deletion whose risk is much higher, maybe closer to 40%, and another child with the same deletion, because of the rest of the genome mitigating that effect, the risk is closer to 15%. So this is ongoing work, but this will help us, because the better we are able to predict the trajectory of that child, the more justification we have for interventions, right?
So how do you use more genetic information to help subtype the kids in the research?
Well, it's because the genetic variant, in the case of rare genetic conditions, the genetic variant is typically, it's either one nucleotide or it's maybe a couple of thousand, in some cases a couple of million nucleotides. But regardless, even if it's a few million, it's a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of the entire genome. And so we're zooming in on this genetic variant, and we're kind of not thinking about the rest of all the genes and genetic variants that are out there. And so we can actually use sequencing or other testing methods to map the rest of the genome and start counting other variants, some of which may actually improve resilience, so decrease the risk, and some of which may increase the risk. And so you can take that into account, and then you end up with, you actually go from a sort of group level prediction. So as a group, children with 22q deletion have 25% risk of schizophrenia. And now you zoom in on one child and say, well, you have the 22q deletion, but let's look at the rest of your genome. And you say, well, in your case, taking into account the rest of the variants in the genome, your risk is actually, your individual risk is actually different.
And that is precision.
And that is precision.
That is precision mental health.
Yes,
so you can try to do that, which sounds like it would offer, a modicum or perhaps a large amount of hope if people can try to use that information to adapt.
Yes.
Are you following the kids that you see longitudinally, either clinically or in research?
In research, we're following a little. There are some subsets of children with specific genetic variants that are in the study and therefore are followed longitudinally. But other than that, I'd love to. But when I was back in the Netherlands, I had my 22q clinic, and I offered parents always to follow up. And clinically, it's what makes most sense. You know the child, you've seen the child, you can, you know the family. There's a trust relationship. The problem with it, or the challenge, is that after seeing 50 patients or 100 patients, you're now entirely clogged, like all your
booked,
time
right.
is now booked, and so you lose the ability to see new patients. Now the demand for our assessment for young parents with children who are identified as carrier of any of these genetic variants is so high that we've chosen to kind of not fall into that trap, even though clinically it's totally necessary to do it. But anyway, so we tell parents before, and we tell them, if you come to our clinic, it's a one-stop only. We're going to do very thorough assessment. We're going to integrate cognitive and psychiatric and academic, all of that in one go. You get a very comprehensive report, but that's it. We're not going to follow up. I'm hoping we can change this in the future, but right now we need first sort of address that demand.
Have you been able to really analyze and produce some information about the research findings from your clinic?
Yeah, we've had several publications. There's many different things our clinic kind of can facilitates in terms of research. So it starts with the fact that you're concentrating the clinical assessment of variants, of children with variants that sometimes are exceedingly rare. So to go back to your own example, or what we just alluded to, if I see a child with a genetic variant that is, like, there are only a few cases described in the world, then obviously having been able to see this child, well, that adds another case.
That's
right. So what we do is we work together in consortia where different clinics, but also clinics that are seeing children with genetic variants are working together, and so together we pool those the information from children who are in and by themselves quite rare, but across the world working together, you get to case series or cohorts that start to become meaningful in terms of numbers, and you start to see profiles, and you can say, well, we've seen 200 children with this variant, and this is what we're seeing. And sometimes it helps also to kind of decrease the initial decrease is not the right word, to improve the impression of the first impression of, let's say, a handful of children. And the reason for this is that oftentimes the initial impression is biased by what we call clinical ascertainment. So maybe the first 20 children described with a genetic variant ABC, maybe the report says, well, all the children have intellectual disability and they all have ADHD. I'm just making this up, right? But to some extent, it's colored by the fact that these children were referred because there were problems for genetic testing, right? And so when you increase the numbers and you say, well, now we've seen 200 or 400 or whatever, like larger number of these kids, you start to see also the children who are, have a milder phenotype, who actually don't have intellectual disability or may not have autism, or so that's also very important for parents to know that, invariably these genetic variants, almost all of them, with a few exceptions, I have to say, the expression is quite variable. So, there are children who are very affected for sure, but there are also children who are very mildly affected and do quite well.
Okay. If you start getting larger groups like that, let's say you then wind up with 200, would working with, so for example, more perhaps basic scientists, et cetera, eventually be able to lead to figuring out what the actual metabolic or cellular etiology or mechanism of that deletion, or would those larger groups be able to help that?
We're doing that a lot, and it's one of the nice things about being in this, having this type of job. You're continuously collaborating with people who are infinitely smarter than you, and you learn a lot. And so I work with people who are doing imaging. So some of my kids, after being in a DAGSY, they are going to imaging study that allows us to look at the configurations of the brain, functional imaging. We're doing a study with several groups, one in Canada and some in the United States, where we're sending, again, children with the 22q deletion, but also other variants. We're sending them a headband, and allows us to do an EEG during their sleep. And so for a couple of nights, they have the headband on, and we collect electrophysiological data, and then we can connect that electrophysiological data to their behavioral phenotype, because we've done the assessment, right? So to what extent relates that, for example, in 22q, to what extent is the electrophysiology in the brain related to the child having autism or not autism, and so on? All these questions, you can look into that.
Yes, so it does seem like it's it can provide a door.
It's a good platform,
looking,
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Are there other programs like DAGSY around? Do other hospitals have programs like DAGSY?
I haven't seen the full sort of gamut that we're proposing, but there are many hospitals that are increasingly aware of this growing group of young parents.
Right, that's what I was fishing for.
And they're
That's
absolutely trying to address that. The difficulty is to make that truly interdisciplinary. I think it's important if you know this group of variants, and the shorthand would be, NDD variants associated with neurodevelopmental disorders or conditions. Right. They invariably go cross-diagnostic. It's never about one diagnosis. Invariably, they sort of increase the likelihood of learning problems, cognitive problems, behavioral problems, emotional problems. And so if you know that, you just, the best way to evaluate these children is to not work in silo, to not say, well, let's let the psychiatrist do the behavioral assessment and, write a report. And then, next station somewhere a couple of months later, in the best case scenario, is going to be a psychoeducational assessment. And, there's a certain IQ and learning profile. Rather than doing it this way, just integrate that into one stop, I think, is really crucial, including the information that is there to be known about the genetic variant itself. Integrate that. And then we work together as a team. So every time we've seen a kid, where we have a debriefing, and I talk to the psychologist. What's your impression? What does the IQ profile look like? And I go, well, behaviorally we see this and this and this. So what if maybe some of these behaviors stem from the fact that in school the child is just extended too much, and the expectations are too high, or what if it has to do with so we kind of all of that kind of informs each other. It makes for better reporting.
So your team actually is, again, taking precision mental health, another aspect of precision mental health, to heart, in that you're really trying to characterize in detail each child.
Yes, I hope so. We're striving to, yes.
I have one more question for you. When we think of genetics studies and things, we think of huge data sets, we think of AI, we think of all sorts of ways to try to analyze large amounts of data.
Yeah.
One of the papers that you have been on in recent years talked about N of 1 trials.
Right.
And those sound like they're a contradiction for precision medicine because, as I'm going to ask you to define it, they don't seem to deal with big data. But it does seem like they might be helpful in treating some of your kids.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you could just spend a few minutes talking about how N of 1 trials fit into treatments.
Yeah, for sure. I think when you say precision child health, precision child and youth mental health, we need big data, and I'm very much in agreement with that. We need big data to better understand associations between all these variables, genetic and environmental variables that we have, and the individual resilience or susceptibility. That is a true statement, but you can't flip it around. You can say, oh, well, everything has to be big data in order to contribute to precision child mental health. So NF1 is actually, and I should say my colleague Danielle Baribeau is really spearheading this, and I'm not the expert here, but she's doing absolutely fabulous work here, addressing the issue of the uniqueness of some children. Now, obviously, every child is unique. That being said, some of these variants, the genetic variants, can be so extraordinarily rare that you will never ever, even if the whole world works together, you will never ever be able to put a clinical trial that is sufficiently powered to look at the effects, sort of group-wise effects. That we're supposed to do that for new compounds. And so the choice then we have is this: are we going to say to the parents, sorry, we can't develop new treatments because we cannot do clinical trials because there's not enough children with this particular variant? So that is maybe one way of dealing with this. The other way is, okay, let's just think out of the box and create new ways that are statistically sound and that allow you to evaluate the effect of medication in a single child. And it's totally innovative, but it's possible, and it requires a very thoughtful and I'm not going to go into details, but a very thoughtful design. But it allows you still, it still rests on the principle of double blindness. So there are periods of time when the child is being treated and symptoms are being monitored, and the parents don't know what is being given, if it's the placebo or the medication, but the researcher also doesn't know. Right? And so it still allows you to evaluate a potential effect of that medication. It's very exciting stuff.
Well, I could go on and talk to you longer.
Yeah, we're having a good time here.
We are, but I think we'll save more for another time. Thank you very much for coming, and I really have appreciated your presentation of a whole range of ways to help kids who have rare genetic issues and trying to help their parents and them have their best lives. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you for this conversation. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening. Learn more on our website,